Okay, it's time for the last installment of Cupcake's Lullaby for The Princess's Bride. We will now read the last 36 pages. Three, Buttercup and Wesley. The four great horses seemed to almost fly toward the foreign channel. It appears to me as if we're doomed, then Buttercup said. Wesley looked at her. Doomed, madam? To be together until one of us dies. I've done that already, and I have the slightest intention of ever doing it again, Wesley said. Buttercup looked at him. You don't have any sort of time. Not if we promise to outlive each other, and I make that promise now. Buttercup looked at him. Oh, my Wesley, so do I. From behind them, suddenly closer than they had imagined, they could hear the roar of Humperdinck. Stop them. Cut them off. They were admittedly startled, but there was no reason for any worry. They were on the fastest horses in the kingdom, and the lead was already theirs. However, this is before Inigo's wound reopened, and Wesley relapsed again, and Physic took a wrong turn, and Buttercup's horse threw a shoe, and the night behind them was filled with the crescendoing sound of pursuit. Physic's mistake came first. He was in the lead, a position he tried to avoid whenever possible. But here he had no choice, since Inigo was losing strength with each stride, and the lovers, well, they just stopped back and forth to each other about eternity. Which meant Physic, the ideal friend, the loyal follower, the lover of rhymes, perhaps the most brilliant of fellows, was certainly the most devoted bringer up of any rears you might mention, found himself on the most hateful and most insidious bewilderment ever conceived by the mind of man. It is not actually a road, Toad, he reassured himself. It's more of a path, wrath. Nothing to cause fret, sweat. They were on their way to the Florid Channel where the great pirate ship Revenge was waiting to scoop them up and head them all towards happiness. So relax, Physic told himself. Treat the escape as a lark, hark, a memory that would in the future bring warm smiles. After all, it was not even remotely a large fork. It was, if you will, petite, sweet, a mere jog in the lane, pain. Physic almost made himself believe that. Then reality took hold. Because it was still a fork, something that required thought, wisdom, a plan. And he knew he could screw something up like that any time. The fork came closer. They were surrounded by trees everywhere, always thickening, and the brutes behind were clearly gaining. Even though the fork was indeed wee, it had been there for a reason. And that reason, Physic believed, that was I'm dreadfully sorry. My daughter's playing Fortnite and she doesn't know how to control her screaming, as no teenager apparently does. So, if you hear that, I apologize. Or was I? Physic believed was that one way led to the channel, the waiting and the waiting Revenge, while the other led elsewhere. And since the sea was their only profitable destination, elsewhere, no matter where else it was the same as doom. Physic turned quickly to ask Inigo his opinion, but Inigo was bleeding so terribly now, the bouncing of the stallion not being helpful when you have recently been slit inside. Physic instinctively reached back, grabbed his weakening comrade, pulled him onto the horse to see what he might do to save him. And while he was reaching, the fork was on them, and Physic wasn't even watching as his horse took the left turn, which turned out to be, alas, toward elsewhere. Hi, Physics said once he had Inigo in front of him. Are you excited? I'm excited as can be. Inigo was too weak for a reply. Physics studied Inigo's wounds, pushed one of Inigo's hands deeper into it, hoping to somehow help stop the bleeding. It was clearly up to him to save Inigo now, and to do what he'd have to get him to the good blood clogger. Surely the revenge would employ such a fellow. From Inigo, this a groan. I completely agree, Physics said, wondering how the trees could become so much thicker so very quickly. It was amazing. They were almost like a wall in front of them. I'm also sure that just past the last wall of trees is Florin Channel, and our dreams will come true. From Inigo, the same, only less of it. Then his fingers managed to clutch Physics' great hand. I go to face my father now, but Rugen is dead, so it was not a useless life, beloved friend. Tell me, I did not fail. He was losing Inigo now, as he held the wounded fencer in his arm. Physic knew for a few things about one of them was this. Whenever the bottom of a pit was located, Shirley was there now. Mr. Giant, he heard then. Physic wondered who Buttercup was talking to until he realized that they had never actually been introduced. Oh, he had rendered her unconscious, kidnapped her, almost killed her, so you couldn't say they were unacquainted. But none of that truly to a formal how do you do. Physic, princess. Mr. Physic, she cried out louder than necessary, but it was because at the moment her horse threw a shoe. Just Physic is fine. I'll know you mean me, he told her, watching her face in the moonlight. Never had he seen an equal. No one had it, except at that moment she was not at her best, since not only was her horse behaving erratically, there was such pain behind her eyes. What's wrong, Highness? Tell me so that I might help. My Wesley has stopped breathing. Wrong as usual. Physic realized the pit is bottomless. He instinctively reached back, grabbed his breathless leader, pulled him onto his horse to see what he might do to save him. While he was doing the reaching, his overburdened horse stopped. Had to, for was now a wall of trees blocking any progress. And Inigo would not stop bleeding, and Wesley would not start breathing, and Buttercup would not staring at him, her face lit with the hope of all that creatures left stomping on the earth. He, Physic, was the only one that could save her beloved, and thereby stop her heart from shredding. Physic at this heroic moment knew what he wanted most to do, suck his thumb forever. But since that was out of the question, he did the next best thing. He made a poem. Physic's in trouble, bubble, bubble. His brain is just not in the pink. His mind is rubble, double, because everyone needs him to think. Great work, no question, considering he was carrying almost corpses on a stopped horse while the princess was weeping, hoping for a miracle. Physic went a different rhyme scheme. Hopefully it would jog something useful. Great armed Physic, blocked by trees. Forget that she is crying. Though lost, and it's all your fault, forget two are dying. Mighty Physic, strong of brawn, who most around thinks brainless. All you have to do is spawn a plan that will be painless. Physic the fearless, Physic the wise, Physic the wonder of the age, Physic who. The who is lost to it, time now, because it is at that moment of poetic inspiration that Prince Humperdinck's razor-sharp, metal-tipped arrow ripped through Physic's clothing on its way to his great heart. Once he realized that they had been taking the left turning, Prince Humperdinck knew they were his. He turned to Yellen, the chief enforcer of Florin, a finger to his lips. Yellen raised a hand, and the 50 trailing members of the brute squad slowed. The moon's perfect yellow dusted of the thickening trees. Humperdinck could not help but stare at their beauty. Only trees of Florin could interrupt, however briefly. A blood hunt. Was there any place on earth with such trees? Humperdinck wondered. No, resoundingly no. They ranked among the treasures of the universe. During the prince's contemplative moment, Yellen gestured for the brute squad to get up into their attack groups. The knifers here, the stranglers there, the crushers in between. The prince rounded the last small turning, and there was in front of him, so beautifully framed by the perfect trees, was the death temple. His weeping runaway bride, the two still men on the buckling horse, held there in their arms of a giant. Damn, he told himself, if only I had brought the royal sketcher. Well, he just would have to hold on to this memory. In the prince's world, the world of scourge and pain, there was still great controversy to who initially attack. Should the nearest be selected, or should it be the leader? Clearly Wesley was up, but at the moment a frail one at best, and the other still man must have had power, since he had killed Rugen. Not the easiest task. It was standard to leave the woman for last. They were not expert at blood. They also whimpered and looked to the heavens for escape. Always good for chuckles around the future campfires. Leaving the giant. The prince unsheathed his bow, selected his sharpest metal tip, made an insertion. He was a great archer, but at night with moonlight and shadow, he was a good deal more. He had not missed a night's kill in ever so long. An inhale for balance. A final smile to the trees. Then the pull back and the release, and the arrow was on its straight way. The prince held his breath until he saw the arrow rip the clothes of the giant at his heart side. The giant cried out with a loud and shock, and fell backward off his horse. As he fell, Yellen led the brute charge, and the battle of the trees, brief though it was on. The 50 brutes at full cry charging, the 3 men lying sprawled on the ground, the lone woman trying to somehow hold them in their arms. As her attackers came, eyeball close, Buttercup had this thought: if she had to die, what better way existed than with her true love in her arms, and the beauty of her beloved Florinese trees covering her with their branches. Even as a child, nothing pleased her more than the glorious trees at the bottom of her farm. And when her chores for the day were done, that's where she went to wonder so happily. What peace they gave. And they would continue to give that peace to her fellow Florinese forever and... As soon as the four... What? And... Okay, looks like I'm going to have to read the author's Bound of Lies, because it doesn't make a lot of sense if I just skip around it. So... Time out. Can you believe that last paragraph? Buttercup about to die, and she thinks of foliage. Horrible, horrible. So do not hold your breath waiting for the stupid battle of the trees. I went nuts when I first read this. I'm like you, probably zooming happily along, and Morgenstern was clearly a master of narrative. But right now I bet you're wondering this. What happened? My God, physics shot in the heart and 2 other guys drifting away. Buttercup trying to hold it all together while these 50 armed brutes, some charging in. We all want to know what happened, right? Here's what you're not reading. 65 pages of Florinese trees, their history and importance. Morgenstern had already started, if you noticed, just when he realized he's got them. Prince Humperdinck does an entire dumb paragraph about trees. Even his Florinese publishers begged him to cut it. So I don't care what brief Those Morgenstein whizzes at Columbia give me. If anything needed getting rid of, it was this. Want to know why he put it in? It actually has to do with the Princess Bride. Or rather, its success in Florin. Morgenstern was suddenly flush, so he went out and brought this country house that was off by itself and abutted this huge government-owned forest preserve. He was indeed master of all he surveyed. However, had been misinformed. This lumber company had title not long after he moved in. Guess what? They began sawing down all the trees. Morgenstern went nuts. He really did. His entire correspondence with the lumber company is right there in the Morgenstern Museum, just to the left of Florence Square. If you're not Cupcake, there is no Morgenstern, and all this is crap. It's lies. Cupcake knows this. You could make them stop in a year or two. His house was all naked and alone and kind of dumb looking, so he sold it at a loss, which just killed him, and he moved back to town. For from then on, he became the country's best-known tree savior. So what he did here in Buttercup's Baby was carefully build this huge suspense moment, confident that his readers would have to read his tree essay in order to find out who lived and died. Briefly now, in terms of narrative, this is what you found out. A. Physics survived Humperdinck's metal-tipped arrow because of miracle Max's Holocaust cloak, which Physic kept tucked inside his tunic, and the folds of it blunted the arrow's impact, saving his life. B. The pirates of the ship Revenge were hiding in the trees, so when the brutes were about to slaughter our quartet, they rained down on them like rage from heaven, and took them all out in a couple of minutes. And when Humperdinck and Yellen saw this, they both fled. C. The pirates, headed by Pierre, their number one guy, the next in line to become the Dread Pirate Roberts, took the forward, scooted out to the Revenge with them, hoping everyone would be alive when they got there. Time back in. As soon as the four were safely aboard, Pierre signaled for the anchor raising. The great pirate ship Revenge slipped through the waters of the Florin Channel toward open sea. A snap of his fingers brought the blood clogger. He set to work on Inigo, while Pierre himself, chief medico and second in command, turned his attention to Wesley, or he was known on the ship, the Dread Pirate Roberts. Physic and Buttercup stood close by. Buttercup could not stop trembling, so she reached out, tried to hold Physic's hand, realized the size discrepancy, held his thumb instead. The clogger ripped off Inigo's shirt, examined the bleeding man. There was a minor sword wounds near each shoulder, but they were nothing. The stomach drew his attention. The three-sided Florinese dagger, he said to Pierre, and turned to Physic. When? A few hours ago, Physic answered, while we were storming the castle. I can clog him, the clogger said, but he will have little use for this. He indicated the six-fingered sword still clutched in Inigo's right hand. Not for a very long time. And with that he scurried off, returned in a moment with a flour and tomato puree, mixed them expertly, began filling the wound. He looked at Pierre, then nodded in the direction of Wesley. Want me to work on him? It was not a matter of blood. Listen, he pounded on Wesley's chest, listening to the awful empty sound. His life has been sucked away. It happened yesterday, Physic said, carefully trying not to upset Buttercup anymore. If you were in town, you probably heard his death scream. That was him, Pierre cried out. They did that to my master. Where was this? At the bottom of the zoo of death, Physic indicated Inigo. We found him there. Pierre studied Wesley for a moment longer before he sagged. He must have been tortured beyond human endurance. He shook his head. If only I had been with you, I would have known what to do. I would have rushed him to Miracle Max. Physic started to bounce up and down. But that's what we did. We went straight there for a resurrection pill. Energy began to flow back into Pierre's body. If Max worked on him, then we have hope. We have more than hope, Buttercup said. There is true love. Princess, Pierre said. You work your side of the street, and I'll work mine. He looked at Physic, thinking. This question, did Max tell you how dead he was? Sort of, but then he slipped into mostly. Pierre nodded. Mostly is not ideal, but I can work around that. Was it a new resurrection pill, not the old one Max had hanging around? Made fresh, I had to gather the Holocaust mud, Physics said. Pierre was getting excited now. His eyes blazed at Physics. Last and most important question. Did Valerie have time to do the chocolate coating? She let me lick the pot, Physics said happily, because he knew he was giving the right answer. It was delicious. Inigo was still unconscious, but he had stopped the bleeding when Wesley finally opened his eyes. Middle of night, Buttercup lay alongside him, the deck, while Physic watched over them all. Pierre approached, Knelt spoke softly. I have the worst of all news. Worse does not exist, Wesley whispered. He studied Buttercup's face. We are together. Pierre took a breath and said it. You must leave the ship, and you must do so this night. Before Buttercup could voice her outrage, Wesley put a finger to her lips. Of course, I understand. Humperdinck is after us. His entire armada. We can outrun them for a while, but sooner or later, as long as you are here, we are not in the best shape for travel, Buttercup said. Give us a few days. My husband is the most powerful man for 1,000 miles. No place on earth is safe from him. Not possible. Much as I would like to, the crew would panic, as well as they should. I cannot have them losing faith in me. Wesley nodded. Then he was silent. Then he and Physic's name, Physic waited. And he said Physic's name, Physic waited. Do you remember the climb up the cliffs of insanity? I don't want to go back there, Physic said. I'm afraid of heights. Physic, Wesley said patiently. I don't want to live there either. Just answer me this. You were carrying 3 people when you did it. And please think before you answer me. Were you tired? Physic waited till he was sure he had it right. Then he said, No. Why weren't you? Our lives depended on this, so please take your time. Physic didn't need time. My arms, he said quietly. Wesley looked at him only for a moment more. Then he turned to Pierre. We will need chains and a small boat, he paused. Go quickly now. You must get us close to One Tree Island by dawn. The Revenge made spectacular time, full sail and a favoring wind, and soon they were sailing through a remote part of Florence Sea. Before dawn the small boat was lowered, and the 4, all heavily chained to Physic, now got in. Neither Wesley nor Inigo were capable of much movement. Physic took the oars. Wesley nodded, and Physic began to row. From the bridge, Pierre said, I pray to see you again. Do, Wesley told him. Buttercup cradled him in her lap. That is so sweet of him, she said. He did not seem a man of great religious conviction. This will be his first prayer, and it could not be for more a needy group. Why do you say that? Buttercup asked. Let us just hold each other, Wesley said, while we can. That's fairly ominous of you, don't you think? Physic listened, terrified, but he had so many questions he did not know where to begin, so he just rowed. And every so often he smiled down at Inigo, who every so often was able to smile back. They were silent then, the 4, for what seemed a very long time. The night could not have been prettier. The weather balmy, the waves all but non-existent. A sweet caressing wind. Ah. Physic rowed on, getting into a fine rhythm, his great arms enjoying the outing. He rowed harder for a moment, and of course the tiny boat went faster. Then back to normal pace, and of course the tiny boat slowed. Physic enjoyed doing that. It got rid of monotony. Harder, faster, normal, slower, harder, faster, normal, faster. Physic thought. I wonder why that happened. He rowed harder again, and this time the vessel seemed close to flight. And it was then Physic pulled the oars entirely out of the water. And the boat careened on faster than before. Much faster than before. And then in the distance, but approaching quickly, came the roar. And Physic said, Oh, Wesley, I did something wrong. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to zoom like this. I was just sort of breaking the monotony, faster, slower, that kind of thing, and I never meant for this to happen. It's not you, Wesley replied, keeping his voice as steady as he could, so not to make things worse for his comrades. The whirlpool has us now. Inigo blinked awake the word. Physic, row around it. We can't do that, Wesley said then. Buttercup spoke all their thoughts then. Wesley, my hero, my savior, what's the deal here? I'll be very brief. Humperdinck's armada is after us. We need to disappear and mend. One Tree Island, from all I heard, may be the best spot on Earth for us. And just what makes it so special, Buttercup asked, louder now, because the small boat was rocketing now and the roar was growing louder. I can't be Pacific because I've never been there, Wesley explained, half shouting, holding tight to the side so not to be pulled overboard. No one has ever been there. It's shrouded by the mist with just the top of a single tree visible, the clouds, above the clouds. The mist is caused by a whirlpool. The island is surrounded by the whirlpool. And rocks no boat can sail through. The rocks crush it, or the water sucks it down. Now you see why it's perfect for us. Humperdinck cannot get there, and soon he will lose interest in trying to. Let me get this straight, Buttercup said. The entire armada cannot get to the island, but we can. That is my belief. I don't mean to be pushy about this, but I am not keen on being crushed or drowned. Wesley, what in the world do we have that they don't? We have Physic, Wesley replied simply. We absolutely do, Physic shouted, happy that the answer was so easily forthcoming. He is right here inside my skin. But my darling, what can Physic do? Why, swim us through the whirlpool, of course. No one answered for a moment, because at that moment the tiny boat began to crack from the pressure of the water, and the roar of the whirlpool began to surround them, which meant it was very close. Wesley checked Buttercup's chains, and Inigo as well as his own, making certain they were securely locked around Physic. The boat had a little left it could do. It brought them close, but now ahead the rocks became visible, and Wesley shouted through it all, Save us, Physic, save us or we will die. Now Physic, as the world knows, had a terrible case of low self-esteem, so he was all the theory behind Wesley's words. Saving people. How wonderful. What in the world could be better than saving people? Especially these three with him now. Nothing. So in theory, he should have made ready to dive in. In practice, he just sat in the bottom of the boat and shivered. Physic now, Wesley shouted. Physic shivered all the worst. I need a rhyme, Inigo explained to Wesley. Then to Physic. Physic is no zero. Physic shivered even more. Do you want a hint? Inigo shrieked as the boat began to splinter. Still shivering. He's a hero, Inigo went on. Physic would have none of it. He put his head in his hands. What could he be afraid of? Buttercup cried out. Physic, Wesley shouted into Physic's ears. Are you afraid of the sharks? Even worse shivering. And a shake of the head. Now the whirlpool was starting to spin them. Is it the sucking squid? Still worse, and another shake of the head. Now the whirlpool began to pull them down. Is it the sea monsters? More shivering, more shaking. And Wesley, aware that he had next to no chance of survival the way things were going, cried, Tell me. Physic buried his head in his hands, and then from Wesley the loudest shout of all. Nothing is worse than sea monsters. What are you afraid of? Physic raised his great head and managed to look at them. Getting water up my nose, he whispered. I hate it so much. And then he buried his head again. The boat was shattering by this time. The final moments they clung to the remnants, and Wesley said, I am too weak for the task, Inigo, you do it. And Inigo said, I am a Spaniard. I do not hold another man's nose. And Buttercup, not for the last time, heard herself say, You men. And as the whirlpool had them in its power, she shook both of her hands and clamped them over Physic's nose. The whirlpool knew from the first it had them, had not lost a battle in centuries. Not since a soldier coming home from the Crusades caught it at remarkably calm time. managed to slip almost past, but a few feet from one tree shore before exhausted, he collapsed backward into the whirlpool and made no mistakes this time. Just kept him down at the bottom longer than it had ever kept anyone, before releasing its grip, letting him float up toward where the sharks waited. The sharks were waiting this day too, excited for to shred, and they swam just on the outskirts of the whirlpool, watching as the body sank. Physic made no resistance whatsoever, did nothing till there was certain Buttercup's grip was solid. The whirlpool took them under, sped them down on their way to the bottom, and Physic let it happen, hoping only that the others could hold their breath longer than they ever had. And soon he could feel the bottom of the sea. It was not deep here. Whirlpools did not love deep water. And Physic bunched his giant body and shoved down with his mighty legs, shoved harder than he had ever before. As soon as his body began its upward trajectory, he started with his arms, his great tired arms, windmilling them, and more ferocity than the whirlpool had ever known. And it did what it could, increased its roar, swirled more savagely, but the arms would not stop. Nothing could make them stop. And the chains held. The others were unconscious from the battle, but Physic knew as soon as he surfaced at the far end of the whirlpool that Inigo had been right with his rhyme. He was definitely not a zero, not this day of days. They were still chained when they reached the shore of One Tree. They stayed that way for 2 days, till all of them motionless, near dead from wounds, torture, and exhaustion. They unchained themselves, stayed close together, and began to explore their new home. You know, we've only kissed, Buttercup said, staring at the embers. Of course, Wesley replied, not getting the answer she expected. Buttercup tried again. We certainly had more than our share of adventures. No one can deny it. And true love, to have that, we must be the most blessed of creatures. Surely the most blessed, Wesley agreed. But Buttercup said, trying for frivolity, thus far, the unalloyed facts that shines out on is this: we have only kissed. What else is there? Wesley asked. He touched his lips slightly to her cheek, sighed. Surely there could be nothing more. This was somewhat disingenuous on his part, because he had been the king of sea for several years, and well, things happened. Silly lad, she told him, smiling. I have enough knowledge for both of us. Of course I should, considering all those classes in lovemaking I took at royalty school. She had taken the classes, but since Humperdinck had instructed her professors to teach her nothing whatsoever, Buttercup, though she smiled, was terrified. I am anxious for your teachings to begin. She looked at his perfect face. She thought more than anything, she wanted this to go as it had gone in her heart. But what if she failed? What if she was just another case of big talk, little do? And eventually he would just tire of her, leave her. Okay, I'm going to pause here because I can't stand my daughter screaming anymore.